Shalom Chaverim. David Daoud is here with us. David, thank you so much from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Thank you for being here.
Zach, it's a pleasure to, meet virtually finally, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm really glad that we were able to do this. For everybody out there, if you don't know David, David is just somebody that I think starts off when you normally follow him on X, where he is mostly proliferant, that he really focuses on the politics, but then out of nowhere, he just kind of comes in for the Judaism and just like how not only clearly observant he is, but also clearly how knowledgeable he is. And so, David, I would love for you just to kind of start off with us, just to give us your story in terms of your background, your family, and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. My family are Lebanese Jews. I'm Jewish. I was born in Beirut, actually. I was 6 months old when we left, so no real memories from childhood in Lebanon. All my earliest memories are in the United States and Israel as childhood, and grew up pretty traditional. Later became more fully observant, and now I'm back to being, a heretic who really loves Judaism, kind of a Spinoza, who I also admire. So after high school, I went to the IDF, served in the army. I was in Tzamchanim, 101st, and the war that I happened to be in was 2006 war. So almost full circle, couldn't get away from Lebanon. And after that war, I don't know how old you were, if you remember it that well, Zach, but there were high expectations for that war, right? The Hezbollah that was left behind in 2000 was not the Hezbollah that we confronted in 2006. The army was underprepared. The intelligence apparatus was underprepared. The army had spent years doing counterterrorism operations in the West Bank, and suddenly you have to shift to a proper conflict that wasn't really prosecuted as a conflict, not at least at the outset. It retroactively became a war. So all of that led from kind of a 500 days of summer split, right? You have these expectations and the reality, which is obviously that we did not in a larger sense defeat Hezbollah. Yes, damage was inflicted upon the organization, but it survived. Ultimately 2 years later, Israel gives them back Samir Kuntar, gives them back Eldad Regev and Ehud Goldwasser, gets back the bodies of Eldad Regev and Ehud Goldwasser. And, you start to wonder, why did this war even happen? And, the war itself initiated these questions for me. I was never really interested in, my mom taught me Arabic as a child, but it was just a language that I kind of found, why am I wasting my after school hours learning a language that I can't use with my friends, right? So I didn't really appreciate it until I wanted to use it as a tool to understand Lebanon. I became obsessed with understanding Hezbollah, and to understand Hezbollah, you have to understand its environment and the country around it. So that kind of launched me on my professional career. I went to law school after that, briefly pursued a career in law, and then the obsession took over and brought me to DC. My first round at a think tank was at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I left them for some time for United Against Nuclear Iran and Atlantic Council. And after October 7th, came back, and it's like being home. It's like I never left. It's the right place to be.
Amazing. Definitely, obviously want to get in politics. By the way, so I'm 34. So I definitely was cognizant and aware of, or I would have been old enough, but I would say that my real Israel awakening didn't happen until I was 17. So really 2008, when my first trip to Israel was. And then I became obsessed with it. And it just so happened that it was CAS-led 2008 or 2014.
No, CAS-led was 08-09, so
right,
tail
yeah.
end of 08, early 09, yeah.
So that was my real first experience with truly understanding Israel through that political lens, and we'll get to that, but I kind of want to reverse and go almost back to the beginning, because you mentioned a couple of things. One is that obviously you were born in Beirut, and also that you were taught Arabic by your mother, and weirdly enough, that I want to talk about as well is the notion that you're like, oh, this is useless. So before we get even there, let's talk about you being born in Beirut, because how old are you?
I'm 36.
Okay, so you're just a couple years older than me, but clearly I think that there are many American Jews that don't even know that there were Jews in Lebanon. Some may know about Syrian Jews, but a lot don't even know about Lebanese Jews. So can you give just a background of what it meant to be a Lebanese Jew, or what it meant for that community to be there, and why there's nobody left?
Sure. So look, I can't speak from personal experience. Again, I left when I was still in diapers, right? Like for me, Lebanon has no resonance. I often have the same conversation with Lebanese who are like, "Oh, you're Lebanese." I'm like, "I'm not. I'm just not." Right? I'm Jewish. I'm American. That's really my identity. I'm Sephardic. Right? When I say I'm a Lebanese Jew, it's in terms of speaking, like, as you would say, you're an Ashkenazi Jew. To me, it's not you're speaking of a national affiliation. So, I mean, that's a function of not being raised in the country. Look, Lebanon, I actually wrote a piece on this for Haaretz in, I think, November of 2021, what it meant for the community to live in Lebanon, right? There was an invitation that was extended by the Lebanese embassy in Paris to the Jews, the local Lebanese Jews, to, reconnect. And, I kind of weaved in between the personal and the communal in that piece. Look, one has to be fair. Lebanon was unique among Arab countries in that it is the only Arab country whose number of Jews rose precipitously after 1948. So the country itself, there was persecution, there were restrictions, there were limitations, there were measures that were taken, but they were minor compared to, say, like what Syria or what Iraq would do in the 1950s. A lot of Iraqi and Syrian Jews went to Lebanon. Some of them stayed without citizenship, but they grew up there. Some used it as a transit point to Israel. So Lebanon became this kind of halfway house for Jews. The community did not. It suffered in limited degree as a result of the subsequent Arab-Israeli wars. So, in 1967, you had limited attacks on the community, and you started to see a consolidation around Beirut starting 1967, 1969. But the community again continued to thrive. Whenever there were disturbances, you'd have other communal militias that would protect the Lebanese Jewish community. So the Kata primarily is the Lebanese Maronite Christian militia associated with the Gemayel family, the Phalangists. There's even stories that Palestinian factions guarded the synagogue during the Civil War. So the community in Beirut existed in this area called Wadi Boujmil. And Wadi Boujmil exists, so Beirut has a green line as well. Israel, you're not special.
Classic.
Exactly. And it divided Christian East Beirut from Western Muslim West Beirut. And the Jewish neighborhood sat right on the, just on the western side. And so when these two communities would clash, you'd have shells and projectiles fall, but it wasn't deliberate. No one was targeting the Jewish community, at least in the early phases of the Civil War. And again, the reports that Palestinian factions guarded the synagogue during that time. Ironically, the synagogue was ultimately put out of service, as far as I know, by an Israeli artillery shell in 1982. Obviously not deliberate, but it ended up hitting the roof of the synagogue, and that was that hole in the synagogue was there until I think the renovation was completed in 2010. So the community was relative to other. It depends, right? So in Iraq, you had Jewish members of the government. You had Jewish ministers. In Lebanon, you didn't have that. Lebanon had a parliamentary seat reserved for minorities. And that, included Jews, included Protestants, included Arameans. So it wasn't a Jewish seat in parliament. Jews really had no political power directly. In fact, in the early days of the state, they went to the president of Lebanon and they said, I think it was Emil Eddi at the time, and they said, well, we're the largest, community, how can we get a seat? And he's like, I'm a Jew. I'll represent it. Obviously, he wasn't. It's a little patronizing, but he meant to say, I'll protect you. He was obviously a Maronite Christian by Lebanese convention. So Jews didn't have that political power, that direct political power in Lebanon. They had communal institutions that were to a degree influential. There was a Lebanese Jewish newspaper called Al-Alam al-Israeli, or the Israelite World, that had to change its name after 1948 because Israeli means the Israeli at the same time, not just Israelite. So it changed its name to Al-Salam, peace, or the peace, which is less provocative. And then it just kind of folded out of existence. And there, the Jewish community, with that lost its ability to kind of respond to the vicissitudes of Lebanese life that were affecting them, and any pressures that were being imposed on them from the outside. And there were in the 1950s and 60s. Again, but not to the degree of but Syria or Iraq. So you get to the Civil War. The country's collapsing all around, especially Beirut, and that's where the community had become fully concentrated. You had prior to that in Sidon and Saida, right? You had a large Jewish community, Hamdun, and up in the mountains. There's a synagogue. But the community started to really consolidate around Beirut. And then with the collapse, people started leaving. In the 1980s, that's when you started to see Lebanese Jews targeted specifically. And it wasn't Lebanese. Well, I mean, Hezbollah is a Lebanese faction. So it was really Hezbollah and the Syrians. And you had, Naim Qassem in his book, Hezbollah, the story within. Hezbollah never fully claims this, but he teases this, right? That Hezbollah did this out of some sort of vengeance for the war with Israel. And they kidnapped and murdered 11 members of the Jewish community just for being Jews. Again, these people were Lebanese citizens. They were loyal Lebanese citizens. I think only 4 bodies were ever found, and some were heavily mutilated. So that really spelled, that period of 1975, right, Civil War to the early to mid 1980s, that really spelled the end of the community as a community in Lebanon. The synagogue stopped functioning. By that time, the Lebanese government had already taken, Jewish holidays off of its official calendar list. It had stopped supporting, like, say, their youth organizations, so on and so forth. And come into the 90s, right, Lebanon coalesces. Look, Judaism is still an officially recognized sect in Lebanon, one of the 18 recognized sects. And if you look at Lebanese voting records, so when the expats were allowed to vote, and not this last election, I think the one before that, there was something like 5,000 Israelites, right? They were on the, and, that's the governmental term that's used for Jews in Lebanon. But they were mostly abroad. As far as I know, there's a scholar named George Neji Zayden who has been keeping up with what remains of the community in Lebanon. And as far as I know from his work, there's about, I think now 27 people left in Lebanon, 27 Jews left in Lebanon. They are, outwardly assimilated. I think they have documentation that, because on your paperwork in Lebanon it shows sect. Obviously, Israeli is not, it's a little bit provocative. It's not just, Yehudi even, it's Israeli, right? So you have that association. And it's not meant to be provocative. It's meant to just be like Israelite, right? The French term translated into Arabic. But by its nature, it's provocative. So, these people have documentation that says they're not Jewish, that they're Druze or Christian or something else. From what I understand, they're mostly intermarried or older. So it's a community. Like I said, the synagogue was renovated in 2010. I remember being a member of the Jews of Lebanon group on Facebook in the years leading up to it, and I got blocked because I was the naysayer. I'm like, is this really a good idea? What are you talking about? A functioning synagogue in Beirut? And look, in the end, it's not a functioning synagogue. It's more, it was damaged during the August 2020 Beirut port blast. I think that damage has been repaired, but look, it's more of a beautiful synagogue, probably one of the most beautiful I've ever seen, but it's a mausoleum rather than a minyan. And it's unfortunately the state of the community now. The community now is, there's concentrations in Brooklyn, in Montreal, in Brazil, I think smaller contingents in France. There are, I think, a handful, the community didn't coalesce in Israel. There are Lebanese Jews in Israel, but there's not a community in the way the Moroccans stuck together, in the way the Persians kind of maintained, or the Yemenis or the Temanim, maintained their kind of communal cohesion. They didn't go in enough numbers at any one particular time, right? The primary emigration was to the west, to Beirut, my friend Isaac Shua will probably not like this, but effectively, the Lebanese Jewish community in the United States is part of the broader Syrian community. Again, it has its own institutions. It has its own synagogues. I mean, when I go to Brooklyn, I pray in a Syrian synagogue.
Well, I was going to say, I went to Mexico City back in March, and
David.
Yeah, and I was very curious because I understood that there was a huge Syrian population down there, and my wife and I actually, because we're nerds, decided to take a 3-hour-long tour just on the Jewish community. And so I asked, what is because I understand there's a difference between the two different Syrian communities down there, and
Halabi and Shami, yeah.
So yeah, our guide had mentioned that there's the one Syrian Jewish community from the Beirut, Damascus area, and one from the more like Aleppo Jews, and like the Syrian Beirut, Damascus are like more metropolitan. They're a little bit more modern, while as the Aleppo Jews are a little bit more conservative or more traditional, and remain as insular as they can. And that seems, based upon you nodding for those that are just listening, it seems to be accurate.
To a certain degree. I mean,
relatively.
At least in Brooklyn, I have not, visited the Jewish community in Mexico City to know the internal dynamics. The Aleppan community is the one that was the veteran community that set the communal structure. Now, they're insular in the sense that they maintain the traditions, they maintain communal cohesion. There's, certain communal laws and rules that are meant to keep people marrying within, not necessarily the community, but within the Jewish people. But at the same time, while there is this is a carryover from Aleppo. Obviously, Aleppo was a trading city, so there was this mercantile culture that's carried over. A lot of people kind of go into the family business. There's increasing drives for people to get, higher education, white collar jobs, not just continuing the family business. And the community it's not like the Hasidic community, right? When we say insular, it's fully engaged in American life. I know a lot of people who are even on Shabbat will find a way to sneak the latest, Yankees scores or something. So they're fully integrated into American life. I think, in terms of how the community sees itself, it sees itself at once fully Aleppan in terms of culture, but also fully American. So 100% here and 100% there. And it's not disengaged from the world, but it is a tight-knit community. You'll have people that are raised next to each other their entire lives, and then they'll, buy houses, a few blocks down from their parents, although housing is becoming expensive. And so that was the initial structure, the Aleppan community, the veteran Aleppan community that came around the early 1900s. And then you had additional influxes that came later, right? 1947, when the synagogue in Aleppo was destroyed. And then you had Egyptian and Lebanese Jews come, and then you had the Shamis, right? The Damascene Jews that were finally let free by the Assad regime in, if I'm not mistaken, 1994. So you had this community established in layers. And it's mixed. You still, I guess people still joke that marriages between Aleppans and Damascenes is kind of intermarriage. They have their own synagogues, but it's not, it's not the hard. There's not this hard disconnect between them. And again, if anything, the Aleppo community, that veteran Aleppo community, is the one that sets the tone for all the other communities.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. That's great. So going then back to your personal story, given the fact that you were born in Beirut, which means that more than likely when you moved to Israel was sometime around the same time that the Soviet Union collapsed and that you had this massive influx of Soviet Jews. And so I'd love for maybe, I don't know if you had this experience, but I'm curious if there was something, or if you kind of now reflect upon what it was like for maybe you as a Lebanese Jew and a native Arabic speaking family that's juxtaposed against the Soviet Jews, as well as obviously you have the established, Ashkenazi Jewish community that, we know is of higher socioeconomic status in Israel. So I'd love to kind of hear a little bit more of your personal story inside of Israel.
So we didn't initially move to Israel. We moved to Brooklyn. Moved to Brooklyn for a short period of time. And my father's reaction was, I thought I left the Middle East, so we're moving to Connecticut. So I grew up in Connecticut. So any waspy snootiness that you may detect in me owes entirely to my environment.
That's what all the books are. The books are
exactly. The pretentiousness is purely a product of my beloved home state. Look, I did grow up around a lot of Ashkenazim. We were one of the very few families that were not Ashkenazi, and I didn't, I get it. Obviously, like I've read a lot about the history of Israel and the Sephardic influx, and I intended, before October 7th, I was actually working on a book about the rise, evolution, and durability of the Israeli rights in Israeli politics, and a lot of the research obviously goes into, right, Menachem Begin, who's right behind me, would not have risen to power in 1977 without the Sephardic support, and obviously there was this narrative or this sense of disenfranchisement that led them to go towards Menachem Begin and away from the establishment labor Zionists. Now, was it racism, plain and simple? I don't know. I tend to reject in everything facile explanations like that. The way I looked at it from just doing this preliminary research was it was more the Sephardim were caught, and I hate the term Mizrahim, but the Sephardic Jews, the Jews from Arab speaking or Arabic lands, Islamic lands, they're caught in between the tension between right and left, right? and they were, if you go, I mean, if you read about the Yishuv, right, the tension between right and left was very strong. I mean, you had the Saison, you had all these different actions. These were practically enemies, right? You go to the early days of the state. Ben Gurion wouldn't even address Menachem Begin by name. He would call him the MK next to MK Badr. So there was this cancellation effort. Jabotinsky's remains were not allowed to be brought into Israel in the early days of the state, right? There's accusations of the right wing. There were fascist elements of the right wing. Abba Achimeir, initially in his early stage, although he said that Jabotinsky disabused him of that mind disease. So there was this tension. The left was more veteran. They wanted to. The labor Zionists wanted to remain in power, and obviously demography in a democratic society is what determines things more than anything. And Sephardic Jews, Jews from Arab lands, I think we were inherently and by default a community that could be counted as right wing, because if you look at the right, they're not trying to establish Judaism anew. There was no idea of the new Jew on the right. That was a labor Zionist idea. The fusion of a secularized Judaism that has socialist overtones would have been alien to most Jews from the Levant. I mean, you did have intellectuals in Iraq and Tunisia and elsewhere that had dabbled in socialism and that had been part of the Arab nationalist movements, which were socialist. But the average Jew in these countries, right, was traditional, if not, not religious necessarily, but traditional, Masorati, what you'd call today. So they dabbled, they were connected to tradition, they were connected to religion. Religion was religion. We only have orthodoxy for all intents and purposes in the Sephardic community. We don't have Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. There's just religion, there's what you do, but you have this nostalgia, this sympathy towards religion. A lot of these communities were mercantile communities, so they're very capitalistic by nature, so the idea of socialist redistribution of wealth probably didn't resonate. They came from countries with political corruption, so trust of the government and kind of a strong governmental top-down structure didn't resonate. So on everything, they would have inherently leaned right. And if the left wanted to maintain hegemony, what you have to do is disenfranchise not just the right, but its constituency. Now, were there elements of what you could call racism? Of course. I mean, what society doesn't have that? The Chachachim comments and things like that. And I think those things overlaid this right-left divide, and then you have this influx of Jews from Arab countries into nascent Israel, 1948 Israel, and it happened in stages. The Arab and Islamic world kind of emptying itself of its Jews, but you have this embryonic state that is surrounded on all sides by its enemies. It's poor, it's dirt poor, it's cut off from its environment. You have arms embargoes, you have economic embargoes, you have limited housing. And then you have these people that come with none of the skill set that the early state needs. And, the language skills that the state needs, right? You have, again, they're merchants. You're not talking about a society that could trade. So a lot of the skill sets that they had were not translatable to the nascent state of Israel in 1948. So they end up being put in the Mabarot, and they end up staying there, and there's no upward mobility. Now, again, was there a certain disregard for them? I'm sure. How much of it was because of the color of their skin, or like these are the Arab Jews or whatever, and I really don't like that term, but and how much of it was just practically, well, we don't know what to do with these people. We don't know how to integrate them. There's not enough housing. And of course, you have all of these things on top of each other. Does it look like racism? Does it look like discrimination because one Jew who came from Poland doesn't like the way another Jew who came from Iraq or Morocco looks? Perhaps, but I think it's too simple of an explanation. Now, the resentment is still there, and obviously perception matters more than reality, right? The average person is not going through the archives and looking through these things we don't. It's just human nature. It's human nature. And there's still certain things that happen that reinforce that old feeling. But it's not like, I like to say that for every time an Ashkenazi Jew has said something about Sephardic Jews, we have sharp tongues too.
I was going to say,
we have sharp tongues too. So look, I mean, I don't know. To me, it's we have this Jewish state as the Jewish people, and it's the only Jewish state that exists. I'm a loyal American. I love this country, but obviously we all have attachments to the state of Israel. We want it to succeed, and I think it's time to just move forward as much as possible. And not be stuck in this, Israel has enough enemies. The Ashkenazi Jew is not the Sephardic Jews' enemy, is not the Yemenite Jews' enemy. Brethren, right? This is building a country together. And I think, I don't know how to heal these wounds. I think they've come back full strength in the past couple of years. We talk of, Israel Rishona, Israel Shnia coming back all over again. But, I think it's not a worthwhile discussion to continue pointing the finger at each other. I'm sure you saw there was a big blow up over a certain influencer on Twitter, who, whatever. I mean, I
He
have
was
my
definitely a
comments
grifter, definitely a psyop grifter. Has to be.
whatever he was. I don't care if he was, the descendant of Mordechai and Esther, because he alleges he's a Jew from Iran. That's not how you talk about your Ashkenazi brethren. And I think the way forward is not by holding on to the bitterness of tough experiences in the past, but trying to build a future forward. And look, I mean, intermarriage rates, if you even want to call it that, between Sephardim and Ashkenazim in Israel are on the rise. Me personally, I don't think I've ever felt, like most Ashkenazi Jews, I think, just don't understand Sephardic Jews. So perhaps some people call that Ashkenormativity.
It's only here in America. That's only here in America. Like that. And look, hand up, like, as somebody who grew up in an Ashkenazi only community in Denver. I mean, like, the first Sephardic Jew that I met, I didn't even know what a Sephardic Jew was until I was 15 years old, when he ordered a rice bowl at Chipotle during Passover. And I was like, no, you can't do that, man. And he's like, no, my dad's from Iraq. And I'm like, there are Jews from Iraq? And like, I learned all about this. And to be honest, like, yeah. And then I had, I had an Israel fellow when I worked at Hillel at the University of Texas, who was Argentinian, he was Syrian, and he talked so much about this, and there's just so much complex identity that, at some point as well, like this whole Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Yemenite, it's all going to go away over the course of time, because, as you live in Israel, people all marry each other and they have kids, and they all look the same. They all look the same.
And the conception of religion, I like to tell people here, even my friends who grew up in Reform and conservative communities, who are like, why isn't there a Reform and conservative movement in Israel?
Yeah.
Like, it wouldn't take hold, because the average Israeli, no matter how secular or religious they are, their conception of religion, of Judaism, is a Sephardic conception, in that there's religion.
Yeah, can you, I want to double down on that, actually, because something that you said, and something that I really appreciate, especially, it's because something that I have been thinking about deeply, especially as there's been so much around Orthodox Judaism, Reform Judaism, and the conservative movement, which is what I grew up in, and what personally I think is one of the better ways to
the one true faith.
It's not the one true faith, but I think that, when I think about how I think about myself, I actually have stopped. I called myself like a ritual Jew, or a traditional Jew, in that way that says, like, look, I don't keep kosher all the way. I just stopped eating pork. I don't, I light Shabbat candles, but, and now I'm only wrapping tefillin almost every day. But for my entire life, I didn't really live what you would call any type of observant life from the perspective of the rituals or the daily practices. But in terms of how I thought of my life, in terms of when I conducted myself in the world, and I said, okay, I have this really challenging dilemma. What is the Jewish thing to do here, right? I would go to the rabbi. What is the Torah said on how I should make this? How should I behave? How should I act? And so now what I'm thinking, though, is, especially as you have so many Reform Jews, frankly, who are finding their way back into the tradition, because so much of that progressiveness and the Reform movement was intertwined, but now that the progressive aspect of their identity is becoming in tension, what I'm wondering is, and also I'm looking at the Sephardic, I'm looking at, Israeli Jews, and we're having this conversation. And this notion of religion, what does it mean to be a religion? And it seems to me that Sephardic Jews, because of their line, right? Ashkenazi Jews were moved they were in Poland, but they came from Spain, or they came from wherever, they came from Italy. They constantly had to move and figure out how to shape their lives around where they lived next, versus your average Jew in Iraq, in Baghdad, or in Tehran, or in Shiraz, or in Damascus, or in Aleppo. I mean, their line goes back centuries, and they were able to practice what I assume is to be what is the closest we get to just after post-exile Judaism. And that seems to actually reflect a lot of what Masorti, or as you mentioned, or conservative Judaism looks like. And so I would love for you to delve into that, because you've obviously lived it.
Sure. Look, I mean, there's been a lot of development and creativity in Sephardic halakha, right? I think the default caricature is that Sephardic halakha tends to lean towards leniency, right? Whereas Ashkenazim, if we go in orthodoxy, right, the kind of the default is like the right thing to do is stringency, whereas with us, the right thing to do is to find leniencies, to find how to be to make something permissible. And I think the reason for that, look, I mean, the Enlightenment, different processes that happened in Europe, right? You had reformation of religion as a concept in the background of the Jewish communities in Europe, and as much as they were, insulated, or you were influenced by your environments, right? You have the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, so the concept of breaking away and forming your own thing and reacting and counter-reforming was something that was in the background. In the Islamic world, it wasn't the case, right? You had religion and you had a spectrum of observance, and everyone showed up at the same mosque, and everyone showed up at the same synagogue, and everyone showed up at the same church, and religion also was an identity marker. So it wasn't even, you're already, if you're a minority, you're already small, you're not really dividing yourself up. And those communities, so you have like the Coptic Catholic Church, which is looked at with suspicion by the Coptic Orthodox Church. Like you're
sorry, I thought that's what you were referring to, but I didn't realize that there was a Coptic Catholic and Coptic Orthodox.
So the Orthodox Church is the older church, and you did have different phases. Islamic rulers like the Ottomans, they would allow missionaries from different Christian sects to come in and kind of divide and conquer the communities. So never took hold in our communities. So the religious and communal leaders had to basically create a system. If the and there were no black hats, but follow me here. If the black hatter and the guy who's coming in ripped jeans are both going to the same synagogue and praying next to each other and are part of the same community and are fully accepted members of the same community and are getting the same communal honors, aliyot, and being counted for a minyan and so on and so forth, then you have to create a communal social structure. Your halakha has to reflect that. It has to reflect something that is expansive and flexible enough to accommodate the saint and the sinner, the holy man and the heretic, the David Daoud and whoever, and the Isaac Shua, who is the saint in this case. So you have to have that flexibility. I think it was a pragmatic, you're not breaking up the religion. So, the unlike in Europe where, the Reform said initially we're giving up everything, and the outward manifestation of their Judaism was indistinguishable from Christianity, save for, the absence of Jesus. No kippot, they moved the Sabbath day of worship to Sunday, organs, so on and so forth, right? So all the people, you have a pool of people, all the people that are liberal minded in that sense are going to go to that synagogue, right? And then you have the reaction, the orthodoxy, right? I mean, you've seen my tweets on this, that orthodoxy is a relatively modern phenomenon. The people that are tradition minded, that are doing everything by the book, right? They're going to go and pool in one community. And then in America, you have the conservative movement that rises, which are the people that are, trying to modernize halakha and trying to look at things in a more academic manner. And that kind of pools together. So you end up having closed feedback loops, right? The Orthodox community no longer has to accommodate the heretic or figure out how to bring the heretic into the modern, the integrate him into, or her into the, and I use the term heretic loosely, right? Integrate them into the communal fold, into the communal structure. It doesn't have to make halakha flexible enough, so it becomes more and more rigid, or it becomes more and more permissive. Well, I guess Reform has gone through phases of hyper progressivism, or to a more traditionalist or traditionalizing orientation, and the conservative movement has, it seems like, in some cases, reformed.
It's also very much based on location. Like, I think that geographic location makes such a difference, because the difference between your average Reformed Jew in like New York City and your average Reformed Jew in Los Angeles, the octaves are different. Whereas if you ask someone like, well, what kind of Jew are you? And they say, oh, I'm a Reformed Jew. And you say, well, what does that mean? They're like, well, I go to high holidays. I go, I do Shabbat dinner only like once a month. I don't, whatever it is. And someone like that would be like your average conservative Jew out in like Los Angeles or like where I grew up.
Sure. And again, like, I think that's, rather than having all those people under one tent, you have them all over the place, and those communities kind of form around, and their communal standards form around the individual. But like, I mean, for me, I've prayed in a Reform congregation maybe twice in my life, and nothing personal. I felt very uncomfortable. It just felt very alien to me. And I think once at Addis, Israel, here in Washington, D.C., I prayed. And again, Ashkenazi services in general don't resonate for me. Like I'm used to certain tunes. I'm an old man, right? I'm basically an old man. I'm like, if it's not in my Siddur, I'm not interested, right?
Can you then, no, I get that. What does that mean? Like when it thinks about Sephardic and it leans into the permissibility, right? Because when we think about halakha, when we think about Jewish law, as an Ashkenazi, I think there is no leniency. It is either kosher or it is not kosher, and that kashrut is based upon like the OU, which I'm learning, at the end of the day is actually not necessarily, it doesn't have to be that way, but they've chosen to be that way. Or one of the things that we've learned, is rice versus not rice, or it's like how much you have to clean your house before Pesach or something like that. So when you say that it leans into permissibility, how do you have Jewish law that is also permissible?
Well, I mean, I'll give you an example. I guess two counterpoints. You think of, so in some cases we are more stringent. So if you take a shechita, right, ritual slaughter of specifically red meat, we're more strict, right? We have Bet Yosef, which is a higher standard, which is if an animal has these lesions on its lungs from the outset, it's not considered kosher. So I guess the corollary standard on the Ashkenazi side would be glatt, but there you can just, if the lesions peel off easily, you're okay, is my understanding. So there we're more strict, but let's take
like cleaning for Passover, right? Like there's that joke I've seen where it's like when you're an Ashkenazi and you're cleaning for Passover, you have to like wipe it down and you have to spray or you put the tinfoil down, and then like a Sephardic is like the bread is in the cupboard. Okay, let's go.
So maybe it's not that not exactly,
that much,
but if we take like, let's say kosher kitchens, right? So Sephardic tradition or halakha would tell you that you don't need two basins. You don't even need two separate sponges, right? Because the idea, and this isn't like, oh, well, there's Jewish law and we made it lenient. We just didn't add the stringencies and make that the baseline for Jewish law. So the idea of tam, flavor, right? That's just why you can't take a sponge from your dairy dishes and put it on your meat dishes and vice versa. So the idea is that flavor in a halachic sense does not transfer if the food substance is not fitting for a dog's consumption, right? That's the baseline halakha. So we're just keeping it at the baseline halakha. So obviously I don't know. I have a beagle who will eat everything. So I don't know if the Talmudic rabbis were aware of Winston and his eating habits because he's a goat. But putting my very idiosyncratic beagle aside, right? I don't think your average dog is going to consume trash as if it were food, or is going to consume food waste, right? Rotten food on that's just rotting on a sponge. So the idea is like, this is waste. It's not food, and waste doesn't transfer flavor. So there's that leniency. The issues of electricity on Shabbat and the high holidays. Right, we forget now how much of a debate there was over what is electricity. Right? Is it a Shabbat violation? You go to the early 1900s, late 1800s, right? Is it a Shabbat violation? Is it one of the 39 melachot? Is it lighting a fire? Is it building? Right? You're closing a circuit. Is that building? Does that constitute building? Right? Because building, I think, has to have a certain level of permanence, and flipping on a light switch is not inherently permanent. Is it a fire? Well, what do you do with a neon light? So it's not that you're What do you do with the neon?
I just have to this is the most absurd thing. I cannot imagine. Like, I love debating and arguing, and I literally cannot imagine myself being in a place where it's like, well, look, the light is the light, but what about the neon? The neon.
What about the neon? What about the neon?
Why would anybody want to be us? Like, it's so funny where people think that like we're we think that we have supremacy. Like, I promise you, everybody, we hate ourselves enough to have these types of conversations. We don't think that we're better than anybody.
I've come to the conclusion that we are, and look, you guys, our beloved Ashkenazi brethren, are slightly more neurotic than us in the Middle East. It was hotter. You don't have time for neurosis.
Well, I was going to say we might be more neurotic, but you are definitely more angry.
Sometimes. I don't know, man. Kahana was your guy. We were chilling out.
We do not claim him. We don't claim him.
But So I think like, yeah, Jewish law, you're sitting there nitpicking about every little thing. Well, what about the neon light, right? If you can't relax about the neon light, you can't relax about anything. So yeah, we're very neurotic people. But you'll have rabbis that will say, and I think the more honest minded, because now there's like a shame element to it, right? If you say that,
which is actually ironic, by the way, because one of the things that I've been pushing back on so much around some of the people that try to claim that the Reformed Jews are not real Jews or so on and so no, they don't even wrap tefillin, they don't even go to synagogue, and I'm like, what is these Jewish values? Jewish values are Jewish law, and I say, well, guess what? Jewish law says that if you shame someone publicly, you might as well be murdering
killing them. Sure.
Yeah, and so I know for a fact that you don't live by that Jewish law. So who's the one that's violating halakha here? But which I find to be funny.
And I don't think there's any point to sitting there and measuring who's more Jewish or not. It's a ridiculous endeavor. Again, we have enough problems, right? I think we can just.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I think that what happens is that those, especially those who are Orthodox, and my theory on this is that there is a correlation between those who find themselves to be more observant, and as a result they end up giving up more in relation to their peers of the modern world, right? They say to themselves, okay, well, I'm not going to be I'm going to keep the Sabbath, right? Or I'm not going to eat, non-kosher food, and so on and so forth. And they do this in the context of the modern world. And so therefore, like, they are making a sacrifice every single day. And I think that for some people, I'm not saying all, but I think that in many people, there is a sense of resentment that has built up over time that says, why do you, who doesn't do anything, who doesn't sacrifice anything, why do you get to call yourself a Jew in the same way that I call myself a Jew, even though, like, exactly. No, I agree with you again, but I think that as we're all human, that there is that natural reflex that says, I've done more, I've worked harder, why do we get to be the same?
Because Jewishness isn't an effort, it's a state of being, right?
Again, I agree with you, but for the record, audience, I am with David. It's more so what the arguments that I agree. It's my theory on those people.
I agree. And you and I have been in discussions on Twitter with other people pushing back on this notion, this idea of, and again, I think it's very anti-Jewish, such an argument, right? The Talmud says no one knows whose blood is redder. No one knows who's more valuable in the eyes of God. No one knows who's more, righteous or doing the right thing in the eyes of God. Leave that. Just do your business, do your Judaism. And if there is an afterlife and if there is a judgment, you'll find out.
I guess right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then I guess the last question, or I guess some of kind of leading into the conclusion of this section, is in general, like, when you think about Jewish peoplehood, and for your own self in terms of your experiences and the community that you're a part of, I mean, do you feel as though that there is somewhat of I wouldn't say a solution, but just as like some background for me, like one of the things that I'm really thinking about now is, what does it mean to be a Jew before the exile? Because we're not in exile anymore. And I don't think that Jews have really actually come to terms with that at a foundational level. And like, at the end of the day, all of these black hats, all of these movements, they all existed as a result of being in exile and having to respond and react to the world around them. But we don't actually have to do that anymore. We actually can all come together as one giant community, as Am Yisrael, and say, like, this is what, it means. And we don't know, there's no dictating, but there's this sense of like, you don't actually have to wear this black hat anymore. You don't have to adhere to kosher. You can adhere to this other type of, and guess what? That's the same. And oh, well, you're Ashkenazi, so you have to do this way, and you're Sephardic, well, you have to do it that way. Well, you're Yemenite, so you have to do, and at the end of the day, that only exists because of the diaspora and because of the exile. So when we're coming back, if you could say, guys, this is the type of Judaism that I think that is going to be the one that fits with the level of halakha, but also is the one that unites us the most. Is there something that you have seen that you would try to implement or that you would advocate for?
I mean, maybe I'm biased here, but I would say the baseline Levantine, Syrian, Jewish, Lebanese, Egyptian, Iraqi, that mentality on Judaism is what I think is the Judaism of the future, because it maintains its integrity, right? Jewish law remains Jewish law. It does not become, I mean, look, I have my issues with the people who trumpet Jewish values because, like, it more often than not becomes synonymous with whatever latest political party platform someone's adhering to, right? And to me, I resent that. Look, Judaism is its own system, it's its own civilization. And you know what? Argue with it, fight with it, hate parts of it, love other parts of it, argue with God. That's what we're supposed to do, right? You disagree with halakha, say it. Right? Reject it. Be at least intellectually honest. Don't say that eating the ham and cheese is kosher. And I think maintaining that integrity is essential. So I think where I see Sephardic Judaism writ large, but specifically, the Levantine approach maintains the outer integrity of Judaism. There is
it puts
such
a fence
thing.
around the Torah.
It puts a fence around it puts a fence not that you can't go out of, because you need to, right? Terms have to have meaning. I can't say my chair is a car, right? A car has to be a car. It has to have certain things to fit that definition. And Judaism has to do certain things to fit that definition. At the same time, because, like you said, we are a people. We are now a people that are starting to get back to the 15, 16 million. Maybe one day we'll get back, right? It's not many of us, but there's enough of us. We have, as a people, we have a country, an ethno-state called Israel, where Jews exist as a people, not just as a religious community that is trying to defend its traditions against the outside. Now we have the ability to experiment and see what we want to do. So Sephardic Judaism, I think, allows that internal flexibility. Again, the heretic to be there with the holy man. And that type of flexibility, I think, is what's necessary for moving forward into the future, because it allows the intellectual flexibility, it allows the personal flexibility, and it allows you still to be part of the same umbrella, right? Not you're over here, or I'm, Chiloni Lachis, and I'm Haredi, and I'm this, I'm that. No, you do Haredi things, and I happen to be, I happen to not believe, and we're still part of the same people. And I think that's the mentality that we need moving forward. It exists, I guess, the dominant form of Judaism in Israel is that. I hope it continues to grow, like that outlook on Judaism continues to grow, because I think that'll break down the barriers more so than anything between different segments of the Jewish people that happen to observe differently. They can maintain their level of observance, still have this thing called Judaism that is a standard above them, right? An objective standard above them, but that's flexible enough to accommodate all of them.
Amen. So in that same way, you argue and, being intellectually honest, and you became a lawyer. And so I want to hear a little bit, did any of your background and your upbringing, did that have a natural influence of not just only getting into foreign affairs, but also very specifically focusing on Lebanon? So
like I said, Lebanon specifically, after the war in 2006, it was just stuck in my stuck in my head. I needed to do something about it, right? What was this organization that bested the mighty IDF? And the more you get to know about it, the more you realize it's not just, their enmity towards Israel. It's primarily towards the United States. They really hate America. As ideologically, not necessarily your average Lebanese Shiite, but ideologically, Hezbollah looks at the United States as its primary enemy, killed Americans, right? So this is an organization, an entity that has caused me, on some levels, you could say, blood personally, right? Like as an American, as someone who volunteered and served in the IDF. So I wanted to continue the fight in a way that would be through other means. And that to me is that's my job right now. That's the way I look at my job. That this is the continuation of that fight through other means. That this is an entity that has juxtaposed its worldview, itself, its arms, its violence against this worldview that I love, the United States, the Western civilization, the liberal order, the international liberal order that was built on American blood in the wake of World War II. And they want to shatter all that. And not just to the detriment of the United States, but I think to the detriment of humanity. Again, the international order is not perfect, but I think we're all better off living under the American aegis. So to me, there's a personal element to it, right? I wanted to push back on it with the means and the tools that I have, my legal knowledge, my linguistic skills, my experience in the army, right? Whatever intelligence I have in my head, I don't know. That's a question, but
don't be self-deprecating. You're not allowed to be self-deprecating.
Am I not?
Like your pronunciation of those words and your multilingual life does not allow you to be self-deprecating about your intelligence. I can, because I don't even know Hebrew, but that's
fine. Fair. But, putting that all in there and just making sure that the mistakes that were made vis-a-vis Hezbollah over the course, not just of 2006, but even prior to that, the mistakes that Israel made, the mistakes that the West made, mistakes the United States made in not understanding this organization, and the missteps that allowed this organization to continue to metastasize and grow and become a threat, a regional threat. I mean, you see what they did in Syria, the slaughter they inflicted in Syria. And if, God forbid, the IDF were to ever collapse,
Yeah.
very well, right? It would be October 7th on steroids, unfortunately. So making sure that we learn from our mistakes and push against this organization in the right way. Again, am I going to change things so majorly by the time, I don't know, if I succeed in moving the needle 1% in the right direction over the course of my life, to me that's a career, that's a fulfilled career.
Fair enough. Well, so before I think we get into that, because, and to be a little bit selfish, even though it might lead to a longer thing, but maybe that's the listener wants it. Can you give like just a few minutes summary of Lebanon? Because what I mean by that is Lebanon seems to be very different than everybody else, right? It's not Arabia, right? It's not Iraq, and it's also not Turkey. It's not Iran. There's this little strip of land, this country that is actually has so much centuries worth of history that is so unique, because so much of it is shared with the history of what is now Israel, right? Where you have, there was Crusader kingdoms, you have the Maronite Christians that have been there since, I don't know, the 2nd or 3rd century. You have Armenian Christians that have been there since the 4th or 5th century. So you have this and then of course it has this 50%, and when in 1947 it was 50-50, which where really else did that exist? And so is it possible, and I have a feeling that its history is what has created its current situation. So can you give just a few minutes of what was Lebanon like that led to what it was post-Ottoman Empire? How like that French mandate was different than the British, because we really don't know a lot, or we don't learn a lot about it. And then leading into 1947 and its independence, and why that created the circumstances for what we have today.
So, I mean, look, you touched on an important point. Lebanon is not homogeneous by any means. And it was created initially as a Franco-Maronite creation, right? You had Mount Lebanon, where the Maronites were concentrated, but it's landlocked. It's not economically and territorially viable. So you have to start expanding the territory to make it territorially viable. And then what you end up doing is including in this, what ended up being called Grand Liban, right? The Great Lebanon, or Big Lebanon, populations that either hadn't really subscribed to the idea, like the case of, say, the coastal Sunnis. To them, the concept of Lebanon was an alien one. Shiites who were politically disenfranchised, they weren't really thinking in terms of nationalism at that time, except for the elites.
And this is at the end of the Ottoman Empire, is what you mean?
Yes,
or
yes. Okay. This is in the mandatory period.
Got it. Okay.
And the Druze, right, who were the bloody rivals of the Maronites, right? There was a whole civil war that happened in the mid-1800s between the Druze and the Maronites. The Druze weren't very friendly towards, well, I mean, the communal, it went back and forth. It's not like anyone was,
of course nobody's,
but so now you have all these groups either that don't have anything in common or that have blood between them. They're told share this thing called Lebanon. So what you have out of that created out of that is this gentleman's agreement, for all intents and purposes, called the National Pact, or the National Accord. And this basically is the famous power sharing structure that we have in Lebanon, right? The president being a Maronite, the prime minister being a Sunni, the speaker of the House being a Shiite, and demographics, right? That is key. If you're the bigger the sect you are, the more influence you get. And the primary sects are the Christians. Well, let me take a step back. There hasn't been a census in Lebanon since 1932. And that is in order to maintain this fiction, right? This idea of parity and making sure that, because if there's 10 Maronites left and you're still giving them 20% of the share, right? This is not theoretical. That's what led to the Civil War. So the French mandate ends, and you have this structure that exists, this temporary coalescence around this idea of Lebanon that is in some ways genuine, but in some ways bribed, right? Some of the Sunnis were bribed into it, because the Sunnis are like, well, what are you talking about? We're Syrian. Well, what's this Lebanon thing? So the Maronites are like, no, join us here in this Lebanon thing, and you get you get the premiership, you get this, but we get more power because there's more of us. Trust us. 932
Why wouldn't
census.
was there a reason why the Maronites would want them to be a part of that, as opposed to if they're
'Cause
saying
they
like,
have to
look,
be.
we're Syrian, why wouldn't the Maronites be like, yeah, go,
Well,
we'll create our own country?
Well, because they're in Beirut, right? How are you going to get rid of
Yeah,
all these people,
that's
right?
fair.
So
That's
they're in
fair.
the coasts,
Yeah,
right? So how are
got
you
it.
going to get right? So and the Maronites, no one had. I mean, this is the idea in Lebanon is there's no ghalib, no maghlub, ma fi ghalib, ma fi maghlub. There's no victor and there's no vanquished, right? Because no one there's near parity. At least again, conceptually, there's this near parity between all sects. So especially in the early, the late 1940s, early 1950s, Maronites don't have the ability to, if they want to engage in ethnic cleansing or something. So they're like the easiest route here is we all coalesce around this thing called Lebanon. We each get our share of the pie, right? So it created this mentality that Lebanon's something you take from rather than you. It's the kind of the inverse of JFK's "Ask not what your country can do for you." So this all works fine, right? The Maronites get more privilege, and the presidency has more power than all the other offices, insofar as they're supposed to be the majority. Except over time, the fiction of 1932 became harder to maintain. So then you have the Sunni who's like, why am I disenfranchised? Why is the Maronite, who there's fewer of them, there's more of us? How come there's a 6-to-5 ratio in parliament in favor of the Christians? How come the presidency is the most powerful thing, right? And slowly, right? And then, this is on a macro level, on a micro level, you have all these like little paper cuts. Slowly the veneer, right? So, the Lebanese like to talk about the golden age that existed after the French Mandate. It's a veneer. This is always a volcano waiting to erupt because Lebanon was built wrong, if you ask me, right? You have these groups, thankfully you and your wife are very happy, but imagine if you get to a point where you need to divorce, right?
Yeah.
And I tell you, no, you know what? We're moving you into this new house and you got to share power equally. And without resolving any of the tension, without recreating the shared identity, so on and so forth. So you have these centrifugal forces that start to pull apart. And by 1975, right, you introduce the Palestinian element. And I always tell friends of mine who are Lebanese or Maronite, I'm like, does it never occur to you why your Sunni neighbor, not them necessarily, your parents' Sunni neighbor, sided with the alien Palestinian over you, his direct neighbor? Right? What led to this dynamic? It's because, again, Lebanon was built in such a way that enfranchised certain groups over others. Those groups didn't have the demography to justify it. Israel, it's a Jewish state, right? You can justify the Jewish orientation of the state and by the fact there's a supermajority. And you don't necessarily have to take away legally people's, right? There's no law in Israel, for example, that says the prime minister has to be a Jew, right? In theory, anyone can be, right? Look, I mean, especially where you have communities with, again, so what is Lebanon? Is it Western oriented? Is it Eastern oriented? Is it part of the Arab world? Is it French oriented, right? So all this Janus-faced tension eventually came to a head. And look, you see the similar dynamic in Israel in that, is Israel a Jewish state? Is it Palestine? Is it, what does it mean for it to be a Jewish state? But again, at least within the 1967 borders, or armistice lines rather, you do have a Jewish supermajority, which makes all of these questions unnecessary. You don't have to use the force of law,
right,
to maintain certain structures or to maintain, say, Jewish privilege.
Which is, of course, why the right of return is such a massive deal, and it's always why, no matter, you could give them 99.9% of the land and every other stipulation they want, but if you don't give them the right of the return, then they won't take it because they know that that's the key to the demography, and that's also why Israel will never accept it.
Exactly. It would end its existence. It would end up like Lebanon, which again is untenable because you have two communities that have different religion, in the case of Israel, different language, different cultural background, different mentalities. I mean, different conceptions of, and again, I'm not saying this even as a value judgment. I'm just saying these two communities.
This is the facts.
These are irreconcilably different communities. How do you even forget anything else? How do you deal with economic policy, right? Are you more socialist oriented? Are you more capitalist oriented? What do you do with political corruption, right? So you're dealing with different cultures, right? Different cultures, different economic cultures, different languages, and that tends to not work. And again, it's not like an indictment even of the Middle East. Belgium is a mess because you have somehow the Swiss have figured it out, right? The Swiss seem to have figured it out, but Yugoslavia fell apart for these reasons, right? Multi-ethnic states where there isn't a demographic supermajority or there isn't some kind of either force putting some group on top and some group on the bottom tend to collapse. And this is the problem with Lebanon. Lebanon, it was never able to form, and it still hasn't formed really, a cohesive and unified national identity. So what's good for thee is not good for me is the concept. I mean, you look at the trash crisis that happened in Lebanon about 10 years ago, right? And it's ridiculous, but it's because different communities didn't want to deal with each other's trash. It's not like, oh, we're all Lebanon, this is our problem, we're in it together. There's mutterings of we're in it together, and you'll hear like these high-minded ideas. Like I remember during the revolution that wasn't after 2019, right? Again, talking to Maronite friends who are like, "Oh, we're done with sectarianism. We're done with sectarianism." I'm like, all right, would you be good with a Shiite president, right? If he or she were the most competent person in the country, you're done with sectarianism. Person's sect doesn't matter. No, absolutely not. I'm like, but right, and you'd hear these people go out into the streets saying "Kilun yani kilun," we want them all out, except for my communal warlord, except for my feudal warlord, and or Bashir we need the solution is Bashir Gemayel, who like was the phalangist warlord, and look, he was part of the problem. If you're talking about sectarianism, if you're talking about getting rid of the sectarian system and not upholding the sectarian structure, he was part of the problem. So you can't have, and then when it came time to elect a prime minister, to appoint a prime minister rather at the time, Hassan Diab was in the running, and the argument against him by other Lebanese was, well, he's not, because the way it works is if you have the most Sunni legitimacy or the most popular Sunni politician, then you get the seat, right? Or if you're the most popular Christian, you're the most supported Christian, you get the they're like, well, he doesn't have Sunni legitimacy. I'm like, well, I didn't like the guy, but I'm like, but shouldn't only his competence matter? What do his Sunni bona fides mean if you are in a post-sectarian mentality? So things like this are very hard to get rid of, and it has prevented Lebanon from coalescing as a country. So this is what allows Hezbollah to exist, right? So the vast majority of Lebanese now are against Hezbollah, but the majority of Shiites are pro-Hezbollah, so it cancels out. Because you cannot step on the prerogatives, the sectarian prerogatives of another sect. That can lead to civil war. So if 99.9% of Lebanese are like, no, and all the Shia are like, I mean, obviously it's not, right? But Shiites form a much bigger segment of the population. But if that sect, if this views it as its prerogative, you just can't touch it.
So one of the things that I think people think about, and this includes me as well, is like this idea that Lebanon is also more quote unquote progressive than your average Arab culture. And, you think about Beirut and people like, oh, I went to Beirut and it was the Paris of the Middle East. I say it myself or whatever. And so I'm curious, one is, you were saying that like it was a facade, but what about Lebanese culture or Lebanese history kind of like made it more quote unquote progressive or modern than the average Arab world, while everybody else was putting women into hijabs and even niqabs and the full dress and everything, and what about is like has led to then let's look into the transition from that world, right, from 1947 into the 1970s that then transitioned into the civil war that then ended with essentially a destabilized and a failed state that we can't seem to find our way out of.
So look, I would say Lebanon wasn't entirely unique in that regard. You look at Egypt in the 1950s, 60s, right? Up until relatively recently, I mean, Egyptian movies were scandalous for the Arab world, right? They were considered, taboo, but they'd show more skin. So Tunisia is very Francophone. Morocco, right? You go to segments of Morocco, there are people there who don't even speak Arabic as their first language. Syria, traditionally, right, especially the urban element, were very much not Western oriented, but urbanized, moderate. So the putting women in niqab, again, it's not across the Arab world. I think you've had a resurgence in the past few decades of traditionalism. You look at Egypt, for example, things that were socially acceptable in the 70s, maybe even 80s, maybe even early 90s are no longer socially acceptable in Egypt, right? Because society has become more conservative. So, and conversely, Lebanon, right? What you're talking about, this idea of a cosmopolitan, westernized, right? The citadel of the Occident in the Orient, it's really like 4 blocks in Beirut. I'm being a little facetious, but it really is. I mean, if you go to Tripoli's far more conservative, to the point where Beiruti Sunnis, who are far more cosmopolitan, far more or internationally oriented, because again, Beirut was a port city, trade city. So obviously you're having more contacts with the outside world. Actually, funny story. the Jewish community in Beirut, I think there's like the B'nai B'rith of Beirut, like snitched on the Aleppan Jews about how they're like backwards and bumpkins, and like, they're look
Yeah.
at us, we're
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
civilized. But again, because Beirut was this trading city, so you think of New York, right? New York is a trading city. It's obviously much more cosmopolitan. The society is much more liberalized than say upstate New York. So you have similar dynamics in Lebanon. But if you go to certain areas of the south or the Bekaa or again Tripoli, they're very conservative. Even certain areas of Beirut, right? It depends if you talk about socioeconomic level. You go to like, again, Dahieh, right? The southern suburbs of Beirut that are predominantly controlled by Hezbollah. This is in Beirut for all intents and purposes, right? Tariq Jdid is Sunni blue collar, right? Aisha Bakar, these are Sunni blue collar areas. They're more. I mean, even the Christians aren't necessarily permissive, right? There's a permissiveness of culture, but I don't know if I'd call it necessarily liberalism. You have this band called Mashru' Layla, for example, and I think their lead singer happens to be gay, and the Maronite Church had their performances canceled because they're like, this is not acceptable. This is not socially acceptable. At the same time, homosexuality and same-sex relationships are officially illegal, but you still have clubs that exist in Beirut, certain areas of Beirut, you have certain areas, right? So it's complex, and the image of all of Lebanon as somehow, well, first of all, the image of all of the Arab world is like this backwards, women in niqabs, I think is, it's too simplistic, and it historically, it hasn't always been the case. And again, you've had certain, Islamism and its Shiite and Sunni forms have had resurgences in recent decades, and they've impacted. I mean, look at Iran, right?
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
not
Of course.
So you've had that influence, kind of the face of society, but at different times. Again, Egyptian movies. I challenge you to go watch an Egyptian movie from like the 1960s.
Yeah.
So, and again, Lebanon, conversely, is not this homogeneously westernized permissive society. And that's again, this goes back to the problem. You ask, like, how did it lead us here? Well, it's because it's not homogenous, right? Because there is no, and I don't necessarily need homogeneity. It's not. It's a heterogeneity of identity and identification, and it's not even sectarian. It's feudal, right? In the sense that the Shiite is loyal to their sect, but they're really loyal to their warlord, right? Nabi Habirri or Hassan Nasrallah, or I guess now Naim Qasim. Or the Sunnis have, well, I guess their leader is now gone, right? The Hariri, he's checked out, but the Christians also aren't unified, right? You have the Aonists, the go with the Free Patriotic Movement. You have the Gemayils. You have the people that support Frangieh, right? So it's really feudalistic. And again, the Druze have the same divisions. Will they unite sometimes if the sect is attacked? Sure, it can happen, but between themselves. I mean, you look at how Bashir Ismail consolidated control over the Maronites, right? He killed his rivals. He went around killing his rivals.
And so when did that? So then, how do we get Hezbollah dominance? How does that feudalism, or that those feuds and those warlords? We now have a dominant warlord. Well,
Sure.
Nasrallah can not rest in peace. Rest in pieces, I suppose. But
one big fat piece. One big
fat piece. But yeah. So how did Hezbollah rise above all of them?
So several factors. First of all, demography. Right. The Shiites, as far as we know, again, we don't have specific or exact numbers, are Lebanon's definitely fastest growing, but most likely largest sect. So you have demography. This is a traditionally disenfranchised sect, and there was a historical process of transition from the old Zama, the old feudal communal leaders, the Husseinis and so on and so forth, who ran the community in a way where it's like, we'll hold on to all the power, we'll get the education, and you guys just stay in the fields, do whatever. Like, why do you need to get an education? Comes this man called Musa Sadr, right, who created the Amal movement in a more activist manner of Shiite integration. He was, Lebanese family, related distantly to Muqtada Sadr, born and raised in Iran, comes to Lebanon, I think in 1953, if I'm not mistaken, and creates this movement to enfranchise Shiites, to make them more active and activist, but as Lebanese, right? So he's the one that starts the process of shattering the hegemony of these feudal warlords, right, or these feudal lords over the Shiite community. Then he disappears. Now, there are people, as far as we know, Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi disappeared him. There are some people who say that the Khomeinists were involved because he was very much anti-Khomeinist, and he was, he had the gravitas to actually challenge Khomeini, so that the Khomeinists were involved with getting Muammar Gaddafi to get rid of him. This is a minority opinion as far as I understand. So this man disappears. Essentially, the father of the community is gone. Nabi Biris starts to step into the role, but he's not up to the stature of Musa Sadr. And then, like 3 years later, you have the Islamic Revolution, or sorry, I think 2 years later, you have 1 year later, rather, you have the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And then 3 years after that, you have the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And you had Khomeinist factions, proto-Khomeinist, proto-Hezbollahs, kind of in the wings. The Israeli invasion catalyzed it because the Israelis had no idea what a Shiite was, right? They looked at Lebanon through a Maronite lens. Israel doesn't have Shiites. There's no reason to
And remind all of us, including myself,
Yeah.
what was 82? Like, why did they invade Lebanon in 82?
So the official explanation is because the Israeli ambassador to London was attacked by Palestinians, except it was not the PLO, it was the Abu Nidal faction. And so this was supposed to be a retaliatory operation against the PLO in South Lebanon. It was supposed to last 40 kilometers in 2 days. But defense minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, and Bashir Gemayel had their own plans for basically an invasion that went up all the way to Beirut. And this was kind of retroactively, the cabinet was like retroactively brought into this. Menachem Begin didn't even know what the actual plan was. It was this creeping invasion, and the goal was crown Bashir Gemayel as president, and he will reestablish Maronite hegemony in Lebanon, which will become the second country to make peace with Israel, and that'll change the entire face of the region. It's megalomania, if you ask me. If the Israelis knew what was going on in Lebanon, they would have thought this is impossible.
Yeah.
If anything, if you ask me, they should have, the PLOs in the south, they were terrorizing the Shiites, right? So rather than arm a militia, the phalangists that are up in the north, arm the guys on your border, train them, have them deal with the problem. You get rid of the PLO, you end up, hindsight is 2020, but you end up forestalling Hezbollah's entry, because what Hezbollah capitalized on was the Israelis went into Lebanon with an army that was suited for the Sinai and the West Bank and the Golan, which is not suited for Lebanon's, right? And doctrine that was suited for, conventional warfare, not suited for the urban warfare that predominated in Lebanon, right? Columns of tanks and narrow Lebanese streets is not a wise idea if you know what you're doing. So the impact of the war really hit the Shiites. And while many celebrated the Israelis initially coming in because they're like, oh, they're getting rid of the Palestinians, once the Israeli mission bogged down for a year and so on and so forth, and you had more friction between the Shiites and the IDF, right? There's one instance, I think in 1983 it was, where there was an Ashura procession, and the Israelis had these young guys on patrol in Nabatiyeh, if I recall correctly. This is a major city in South Lebanon. They have no idea what Ashura is, because why would they? Major procession blocking the road. This Jeep is honking, get out of the way. The procession takes offense because they're like, you're disrespecting our religious rights. The Israelis have no idea what's going on. They turn on the Jeep. The Israelis panic. I forget I think they may have, killed 3 people, but there you go, right? These are the new enemies of Hussein, and that's the stuff that Iran capitalized on, that Hezbollah capitalized on, those missteps to create this idea that the Israelis were the enemies of the Shiites. And again, they weren't withdrawing. I think it took until 1985 for the Israelis to withdraw to South Lebanon, so they stopped looking like liberators. They look like new occupiers, the friction. So all this stuff allows Hezbollah to move in and, catalyze its rise. It would have occurred anyway, right? But would Hezbollah have ever been as big? Would Hezbollah have ever as metastasized as quickly? Probably not. So that's one element. So in the 1980s, right, Lebanon's this fractious country, and Hezbollah is one faction among many, and they were fighting with the Syrians. And the Syrians had no patience for them. Right? The Assad regime, Hafiz al-Assad, killed a bunch of them because, no one crosses Hafiz al-Assad. So come the end of the civil war, suddenly Hezbollah is the odd man out, right? Syria is the new hegemon. Syria controls Lebanon, and they've already tasted Syria's ruthlessness. The other Lebanese are recoalescing, at least on the surface, around the flag. The civil war's over, or whatever, right? They're reuniting under the banner of Lebanon. You can no longer be the Islamic Revolution in Lebanon, right? That
And
is
this is in
killing
the early
Westerners.
90s, just for everybody. This is in the early 90s.
Yeah, the early 90s. This is 1990, 1992, you could say, right? So Hezbollah is at an inflection point. Like, what do we do, right? Everyone's rallying around the flag. We can't say we're here to topple the flag, even though, according to their open letter, they wanted to do it democratically, right? They wanted to bring down the sectarian system through the ballot, not the bullet. But again, everyone's rallying around the sectarian system. And not only that, Syria is saying we want this sectarian system, and they've already tasted the wrath of Syria. So what do? Do you fight Syria and all the Lebanese and risk getting wiped out? Or do you integrate yourself into the new dynamic? And what Hezbollah did, actually under Abbas al-Musawi, and after his assassination in 1992, Hassan Nasrallah, was it acted pragmatically. This is something we don't realize about Hassan Nasrallah, that he was a very smart, pragmatic man. Behind the bombast and, the rhetoric, the man knew how to navigate the seams. So Hezbollah positioned itself as the Islamic resistance in Lebanon that was focused exclusively not on killing Westerners, because if it was continuing to kill Westerners, it would have angered the Syrians, who at the time, right, the Soviet Union's collapsing, the Syrians want better relations with the West. They're not going to tolerate that. But Israel's occupying the Golan Heights. We'll attack Israel for you, right? You can use South Lebanon now as free leverage over the Golan Heights. And Lebanese, you want your territory back, right? We'll attack the Israelis. And, we get to grow our in the interim, under this, this cocoon of being the Islamic resistance. No one's going to challenge you for growing your arsenal.
Yeah.
Because, you're serving all of our interests. And by the time the Israeli occupation ends in May 2000, Hezbollah is too powerful to dismantle. Syria still controls the country. This is still an asset for Syria. April 2005, Syria withdraws. And at that point, Hezbollah integrates even more into the Lebanese state, right? They joined the government for the first time. In 1992, they joined parliament. They ran for parliamentary elections, again, to have a say in how things were done. And they acted as, in some ways, as Syria's loyal opposition against the government. So very often
loyal opposition to the government. Got it.
So they would act as a check on, say, Rafiq Hariri, especially, who, again, had his own questionable relationship with Syria. He's not the saint and martyr everyone makes him out to be. But Hezbollah definitely kept the pressure on him from within parliament. So they made themselves useful to Syria. They made themselves useful to the Lebanese. And in the interim, they grew their social apparatuses, which is the real source of their strength, right? They turned to the Shiites, who, again, were disenfranchised, and you got the taste of activism, of involvement, of some degree of dignity. Yeah, we'll give it to you. We'll give it to you. We'll give it to you effectively, right? We'll get you in government. We'll find you jobs. We'll give you schools. We'll give you orphanages. And we have the weapons, right? Amal disarms, right? Hezbollah makes itself useful to the Syrians. So the Syrians force a reinterpretation of the Taif agreement that excludes Hezbollah from disarmament, right? Rather than being under Section 2, I think it's paragraph B, right? Militia that must be disarmed. It's Section 3, paragraph C. It's one of the all necessary means to combat the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon. So it gets this exemption.
So then, all right, we could go on forever. But what I want to do now is tell me how we got to here, because Israel essentially loses the Second Lebanon War, and you have UNIFIL, you have this armistice, and then you also, what I didn't hear, I heard a lot about Syria, but we didn't hear a lot about Iran, and we've been hearing now for the last 2 years, especially, that Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. From 2006 to, let's say, October 7th, 2023, right? Let's use that as the demarcation line right there. How do we get to this point where basically the UN just doesn't care, UNIFIL doesn't do any of its job, and Iran starts to emerge as a regional power?
So several factors here. First, yes, Hezbollah is not just a proxy of Iran, it's an extension of Iran, the way my arm is an extension of me. However, because Syria was hegemonic, the relationship had to go through Syria. So Syria created this dominance over Hezbollah. It wasn't an ideological linkage. Hezbollah had to maintain a modus vivendi with Syria, but its ultimate loyalty was to Iran. And that had to go through the parameters that Syria set until Syria withdrew in 2005. Right. And then you replace the Syrian occupation with a direct and growing Iranian occupation. So the 2006 war happens. Resolution 1701 ends it. UNIFIL's mandate is made more robust, which I always say this, it always reminds me of like roast beef for some reason when I hear that term. It makes me hungry. But what UNIFIL was never tasked to do was to disarm Hezbollah. Right? If you read its mandate, its role was to be an auxiliary of the Lebanese army and Lebanese state, which had the duty under baseline international law that was reaffirmed under Resolution 1701 to clear the area south of the Litani River of all arms, weapons, and personnel that weren't, of all armed groups, secure its borders, right, for the entry of personnel and weapons, unauthorized weapons and personnel, as a preliminary step to disarming all armed groups, right? However, similar to how because of the social dynamics in Lebanon, because Hezbollah has power and because it has social power, that's the more important part. It's not just its arms; it's the fact that it has, a million Shiites behind it. Because of that, Lebanon couldn't directly confront Hezbollah. So they had to resort to the same word games that they did, but for different in the 1990s with the Taif Agreement, but for different reasons. So all of a sudden, Resolution 1701 requires the disarmament of armed groups. But Hezbollah's a resistance. It's not an armed group. It doesn't really qualify. Yeah, that would make your head spin because there's really no point for Resolution 1701 absent the disarmament of Hezbollah. Again, you look at the preamble to Resolution 1701, the introductory language, it is all focused on the reasons that gave rise to the Second Lebanon War, and that's Hezbollah's armament, right? But Lebanon has played these games. This is how it is maintained, this balance between pretending to be, to accommodate the international community's standards and internally not imploding, right? Not leading itself to another civil war. And you can understand why, the Lebanese don't want another civil war. We in the United States,
of course,
we think like we have no one in living memory who's experienced the civil war.
Yeah.
The Lebanese do, right?
Yeah.
So they see what happened in Syria. So I like to remind them of their own experience. So you understand they're like, we're not trying to rock the boat here. So Hezbollah capitalizes upon this. You don't want to rock the boat? Great. That gives us the advantage because Hezbollah is willing to rock the boat up to a point, and that allows them to continue growing their social apparatuses, growing their military apparatuses. Again, you no longer have, you have two factors, right? Syria's withdrawal in 2005. Actually, three factors that relate to Syria. First of all, the death of Hafez al-Assad in 2000. Now, this is a man who kept the relationship with Iran and Hezbollah one where Syria was on top. You want to come to Hezbollah, you come to me, Iran, right? He kept the relationship hierarchical. Bashar al-Assad comes in and creates an equality of relationship between him and Hassan Nasrallah, right? So this already resets the dynamic. Syria withdraws in 2005. So you no longer have Syria controlling Lebanon and controlling what happens in Lebanon and even how Hezbollah operates. And then the Syrian civil war happens, right? Where there is no such thing as the Assad regime anymore. Bashar al-Assad, until his timely, if only it happened sooner, deposal, was basically the governor of the presidential palace in Damascus at Iran's pleasure. So all those factors together, Syria just becomes this open territory for supplying Hezbollah, and there's nothing to deter or stop them in Lebanon. And they continue growing. Now, then October 7th happens, right?
So October 7th happens, and supposedly Sinwar's plan is for the Ring of Fire to finally activate. And yet, it didn't. Hezbollah, they start firing rockets on October 8th, but at the end of the day, they did not do what they were supposed to do. Why?
Well, I guess it depends on what they were supposed to do. I think my sense, I've always asked myself this question because you listen to Nasrallah and all these, leaders, right? And they're like, the Israelis, right? They'll say things like the Israelis aren't a real people. They know that they're not connected to this land. They all have a second passport and their bags ready, right? They know that they're an artificial creation, and the only thing that's holding them together are like the brittle lies of Zionism, right? And I've always wondered to myself, obviously you're going to tell this to your followers, right? Because if you tell your followers you're actually dealing with a real people that are really connected to this land and they're willing to die rather than be wiped out entirely rather than leave this land, people are gonna be like, well, what do I need with this anyway, right? Like if they're they're like, I'll just come to a modus vivendi with them. So you actually end up undermining your own utility. So you have to spread this narrative, but then you start believing it. And October 7th, to me, made me think that maybe they did start believing it, right? Because what you had the judicial overhaul protests, right, the year before. And all of a sudden, Israel, this goes back to earlier conversation, Israel's tearing itself apart, right? You have going back to these the issues of Ashkenazim and Sephardim that had been moved on from, right? Israel Rishona, Israel, it's all of a sudden back again, religious, secular, right? The fight over the Mechitza in Dizengoff Square over Yom Kippur. I remember, I think it was on Khan, right? One of the commentators was like, we were about to kill each other over a cloth. So if you're looking from the outside, you don't know Israelis because you have no real relationship with them. All you know is like looking from the outside. You buy this narrative that Israelis are this fictional, brittle people, and it's only held together, that they're only held together by the fictions of Zionism. And then you start to see those fictions fall apart, right? Israelis are at each other's necks. And if we attack now, right? So the reason for attacking then, Saudi Arabia and Israel were about to come to normalization, which is a threat to the Iranian regional project. We can get into the why, but you see this 0 hour, and now's the right time, because if we hit them now, they're already at each other's necks, and the man leading them is a man they don't trust, right? They're not a real people. They won't coalesce around each other the way a real people will. They'll crumble. They'll take, maybe they won't leave immediately, but they'll take the beating, and we'll get what we want, and end of story. What confirmed this for me to a certain degree was Naim Qasim said this in April of 2024 to NBC News, our NBC. Why'd you start this? He's like, we didn't expect this to last this long. We thought it'd be a couple of months. Right. So why
didn't Nasrallah, why didn't Hezbollah join in because Sinwar, I understand why he did it, but then the moment of the hour is here, and all we're going to do is fire some rockets, but we are not going to mobilize our tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands force to invade in the north and end Israel.
So what you don't want, right? So this kind of goes back a few years prior to that. 2019, Lebanon has an economic collapse. One of the worst in history. Currency's useless. I mean, electricity had always been spotty in Lebanon.
Yeah,
things were terrible, right? And the average person, right, they can't afford food, right? They're losing their livelihood. You do not want to be the guy, Nasrallah, who brings a war upon this man for something. This guy's already suffering, and now he loses his home. Not only is his money worthless, now he's losing the roof over his head. Does this average person love Israel? No. Do they hate the Jews? Probably. They don't want to die for Palestine.
Yeah.
Right. Not gratuitously. So you do this, you're trying to, you misgauge the Israelis. You think, if I go full in, that'll justify them, even for 2 months, we don't want to deal with that, right? Even if it's like a short war, we just don't want to deal with Israel going all in, because right now we're trying to have all the benefits, right?
Yeah.
Dividing the Israeli attention, messing with the Israeli national psyche, draining the Israeli economy, dividing the army on two fronts without any of the costs, which is destruction upon Lebanon, potentially risking social anger, especially from within the Shiite community against Hezbollah. So we can have our cake and eat it too. We don't need this right now. And it's going to last a couple of months. Like, it's not like Hamas is going to get destroyed. Be a couple of months, right? And we'll get this done and over with. So if anything, Hezbollah functioned as it was supposed to function. And this is how the resistance, I actually wrote a piece on this at the time, that Israel underestimated Hamas and Gaza because it doesn't understand how the resistance axis operates. Right? Because what was the logic? Remember Tzachi Hanegbi on the first Shabbat after October 7th. He gets up and he says, mea culpa. I think he was one of the first people who said mea culpa. And he's like, we thought Hamas, right? So you have the May 2021 conflict. And then you had two subsequent conflicts, right? I think it was one in 2022, and I think the last one was like in August of 2023. Small conflicts that only Palestinian Islamic Jihad joined in. And Hamas sat it out, right? After May 2021. Tzachi Hanegbi was saying, well, we thought that Hamas had internalized the lessons of May 2021 and they were done. Really, they were just taken off the line, right?
Yeah.
Because that's how they operate, right? PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, could take the beating then. Hamas, we're taking you off the line either because you can't take the beating or because we're holding you in reserve for something else, right? And that's what Hezbollah was being used, right? Harass, divide detention. Of course, the Israelis are going to have a little bit more of an extreme reaction than they would, if you just fire a few rockets, you kill 1,200 people, you do this whole thing. Of course, it'd be a little bit more extreme, but just harass them enough until they tire out, and they will, because no one trusts Bibi and they're not a real country anyway, right? So that was the logic. Do what you're supposed to do. Don't go all the way, because that's what we need you to do right now. And the Iraqis had their own duties, and the Yemenis had their own duties, right? So if anything, to me, the plan operated exactly as it was supposed to.
Okay, that's fair. So then we all know the famous pager story, right? And it obviously, and funny enough, it didn't actually do the whole thing because we didn't get the walkie-talkie piece to it. But I think that there is
Right, exactly.
But one of the things that you you really are, or you seem to be, the lone voice, I think, on all of X, and frankly, maybe in the entire like pro-Israel apparatus, that is trying to point out that Lebanon is not over. Well, everyone's like, oh, Lebanon's been defeated. We crushed them. There was nothing. I can't believe we didn't even have to put feet on the ground. What, whatever. And you're like, no. And then and people are like, look at the Lebanese president or the prime minister and look at the words he's saying. And, they want peace with Israel. And you're just like, everybody, what is happening? They're not disarming. There's nothing is happening. Nothing is changing. What is it about the world that doesn't seem to understand? Like, why are they so fixated on this, and why won't they see what's right in front of them?
I don't know. Look, I don't know. I mean, I guess if I had to put myself in other people's shoes, and it seems like a lot of people are turning around, right? I had a conversation actually with a journalist I'm very friendly with today. And, she was initially a skeptic about my skepticism. And today she's like, you've won me over. I'm like, well, so look, the way I looked at it, there were certain components that always held Lebanon back from acting against Hezbollah. Only one of them was the military apparatus. That wasn't the end-all be-all. I think the problem is when you look at Hezbollah as an entity that controls Lebanon by fiat, by force, not an entity that is an integral part of Lebanon's political and social fabric, which then uses that to push things around and push the limits. Right? And those are two very different dynamics. Right? Hezbollah is not an alien thing. Nasrallah was loyal to Iran. He was also 100% a Lebanese citizen. Same thing with all of Hezbollah's fighting cadres. These are Lebanese. And the main component that had shielded, right? If you have a terrorist organization that has no political support, right? It's a finite group. You can slowly erode it.
Yeah.
But if you have 1 million people, right? Estimates, and again, 85% of the Shiite community has, in 2024, there's an Arab Barometer poll said, this is the last poll that I've seen, that I've seen that said, queried people's opinions. 85% said they have a favorable opinion of Hezbollah. 5% said they didn't. 5% said they didn't. You have this 10%, am I mathing right? That in the middle, that's like we just, I don't know, very different, right?
Yeah.
And within that 5% isn't necessarily unified. They're not necessarily not at each other's necks, right?
Yeah.
So Hezbollah is, the Emma party is still there and it still wins seats, but it's not the dynamic force that Hezbollah is, right? So you want to go like and look, the hardcore Emma supporters hate Hezbollah and vice versa. Putting that aside, the average Shiite views Hezbollah as their communal tripwire, right? You go after them, you're weakening us in Lebanon. You go after them, you're going to leave us exposed to the bloodthirsty Israelis, which is what Hezbollah has convinced them Israelis, who are going to come after us, to the Takfiris, to the so on and so forth. This is our protection, right? So you go after them, you're going after a whole community. So it's not just, it becomes a civil war. And that component never changed. I looked for the milestones, right? September 2024, there was this polling that came out. Then I'm like, well, let's not say anything until we see something concrete that shows the Shiites are moving away from Hezbollah. The ceasefire goes into effect. You have thousands of people go back to their areas in, most parts of South Lebanon, not the areas the Israelis continue to occupy, Beirut and the Bekaa. Thousands of them are waving Hezbollah flags. This is all on TV. Right.
So why doesn't anybody care? This is what I don't understand, which is I understand why the United Nations, why the international order doesn't care about Hamas and by UNRWA and everything, because they have a vested interest in leveraging Palestine against Israel, right? The settler colonial, military occupying, genocidal regime, right? But Israel is not. That relationship between Israel and the Palestinians does not exist in Lebanon. So I don't understand why why nobody seems to care that Hezbollah and a terrorist organization has created this failed state, because whether they are a failed state or not has no bearing on Israel and Israel's story.
So I would correct one thing. I would say that Hezbollah didn't create the failed state, it's exploiting it, right? It's a symptom of the failed state. Why don't they care? Look, again, I think there's a misunderstanding of how this dynamic operates. I think there's a misperception of what is the dynamic between Hezbollah and Lebanon. Right. Again, it's this idea. I mean, there's, I guess, an element of neoconservatism in it, right? The idea that these terrorist organizations can't be organic and can't be organically supported, right? That these are alien things, that if you would just get rid of these guys, just weaken them militarily, then the people would rise up. It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. The other element of it, look, you got to blame the Lebanese themselves. You have a lot of Lebanese activists for their own reasons, and I'll let them explain their reasons, who are telling you, no, we're ready. We're ready. Just give us the means, right? But we've given you the means. We've given you the means since 2005. The LAF has been on our payroll, and we've been training since 2005. We've seen nothing, right? So, the Shiites are revolting. We haven't seen any of that. We saw protests amidst the war
But why
against
doesn't
Hamas and
the
Gaza.
international order care? Like, why
It's
don't
too
they
small.
make it a bigger deal? Why don't they say, like, what is it in their best interest? Like, if Lebanon or if they are violating the ceasefire, and despite the fact that they're violating the ceasefire, the news media apparatus, the international order doesn't care and says that Israel's the bad guy because they're what benefit? Like, there's just all I can think of is that they just hate Israel to that extent that it doesn't matter whether it's a part of the narrative or it's not a part of the narrative. They want to hurt Israel.
So I don't know if that's it necessarily. So if we're talking about the international community, right, let's break that down. So if we're talking about the UN, right, the UN also has Russia and China in it, right? And Russia and China don't recognize Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. If anything, they probably view it as an asset because not because of Israel necessarily. I think
certainly
Russia and China are ideologically agnostic on the Israel issue. They probably only side against Israel because for realpolitik reasons, right? They want to appeal to the Arab world.
Yeah.
They can't benefit anything from this tiny country of 9 million people. They want to like be on the good side of, the Muslim world writ large, but also the Arab world. So, they have their interest, and the stronger that Hezbollah is, the weaker that America and its allies, or America's allies are in the region, and therefore, as a result, America's regional influences. So they have a benefit in Hezbollah remaining strong. When it comes to actors like France, for example, so France, this was the old European mentality that, France is like one of the last holdouts on this. The idea is stability, right? They want to talk to everyone. So the idea is if we buy short-term increments of stability long enough, Lebanon will get fixed, right? We just don't want Lebanon to collapse. And Hezbollah, right, in the last parliamentary elections, we have one coming up in May of 2026 and May of 2022, they won the most votes of any party in parliament by 150,000 votes. 356,000 votes for them. The second largest party by number of votes, not by number of seats, because the seat distribution mechanism gave Lebanese forces more seats, but they had 150,000 more votes than Lebanese forces.
And that's a real ballot. That's not a fake ballot. That's a real ballot.
This is UN certified. I mean, look, is there intimidation?
No, but I'm saying that because there are people be like, oh, well, that's not real. They steal it, but like, so I want you to clarify.
Everyone steals.
That says like, this is for the most part like a very real of a ballot as
you're going to get. In Lebanon, because like, again, what Hezbollah does, everyone else does. We want to make them out to be the bad guy, right? Like everyone engages in, vote buying and vote intimidation and all that stuff. They want to make sure their areas go to them. So again, this isn't to say that Hezbollah are the good guys or that we should just, no, it's to say, every man in this village is questionable, is morally questionable at best. So you can't ignore Hezbollah if you want to deal with Lebanon. If you have this mentality that we need to maintain stability, and again, it's not working. The French idea, it's not anti-Israel. It's we just want Lebanon. We want to keep Lebanon on life support until they one day wake up out of their.
Is it because they have this like weird sense of ownership, like that it's like it's our fault and like we're just so guilty, like we feel so much internal
It's not even
guilt.
It's not even guilt. It's a certain emotional attachment. It's like your stepchild, right? You raised the stepchild, you brought it, and they have this. You talk to French diplomats and. I don't know. In their conception, Lebanon is still what it was in like 1974, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's not
the Paris of the Middle East.
Exactly. And they want that to be to come back, to be maintained, what have you. They'll do whatever it takes to keep Lebanon from imploding. Except the strategy isn't working. Qatar, by the way, does the same thing in Lebanon, right? They don't meddle internally. And again, not because of how they do things elsewhere. Their whole point is like, this is too big for us to solve. What do you want us to do, right? Here's some money and just like, don't fall apart and like, don't cause problems for the rest of us. Just like keep limping along. Except Lebanon isn't limping along, right? There's a downward spiral that this is actually facilitating. So it's not anti-Israel per se. I think it's either misdiagnoses of the problem or bad solutions. And that ends up, again, allowing Hezbollah to say, fine, we'll meet with the French envoy. Why the heck not? That gives us international legitimacy. And that means that the EU is not going to sanction our political arm and we can still fundraise in the European Union.
So as a last question, because you said bad solutions, is there a solution? And if so, when you think about it, because obviously like, it's multifaceted and, there's all these different moving pieces and so on and so forth. But if you theoretically had to move or radically shift one piece that you really think would have the most impact, right? Where if you had to dedicate your life, right, where you're not going to move the needle 1%, but you're going to move the needle 20% or 30%, what is the thing that we all should know and we all should be advocating for that's going to make this dramatic shift?
I don't know if it's something you can advocate for, because you can't engineer societies, right? These are the lessons that we learned, I guess, from Iraq and Afghanistan the hard way, and Israel from 1982, right? Every time a power has tried to engineer a society, it's failed.
Well, then what needs to happen, right? What needs to
happen is Hezbollah has to lose Shiite legitimacy. However that happens, right? However that happens, the Shiites need to look at Hezbollah as a liability to their life in Lebanon rather than an asset. And until then, they're not going anywhere.
How do you do? Is that even possible at this juncture?
I mean, I don't know. Honestly, I've struggled with this because it's not an easy thing, right? It's not something, we occupy, South Lebanon or Lebanon the way we did Germany and Japan and re-educate. I don't know. I'm not a fan of doing it. Yeah.
No, but also like it's so different because as opposed to, when I think about the occupation of Japan or Germany to denazify or to get rid of that imperial mindset in Japan, there was the ideology when people say like, oh, well, you can't, kill an idea or kill an ideology. I mean, that's clearly not true because we did it with Japan and we did it with Nazi Germany. But the difference is that those ideologies were very specific and distinct to the land in which they existed in, right? And that is not the case when it comes to Shiite Islam, that no matter how much you were to try to quote unquote denazify or de-radicalize, like there's 1.5 billion Muslims. And so if you were to take 5% that were to be continuously radical, or every time you de-radicalize this, piece of land and these Muslims, you have another 5%, which is, I can't even do the math, but it's in the tens of millions that would go back in and re-radicalize them. So I don't even know if that's possible.
So it's not entirely interchangeable, right? Like I would consider in some ways Khomeinism an aberration of Shiite Islam. And I'm not saying this to be, politically correct or anything. Shiite Islam is traditionally quietist. And here comes this activist strain that says, not only this activist strain, but one that says that, this idea of this idea that the vicar of God on earth is this man who is the supreme leader of Iran, and you must follow his dictate, and the kind of the wedding of church or mosque and state, if you will, in this one person. So that is unique. However, when you go to Hezbollah's support base, one should not say it. So the way actually. One scholar put it best, the Nasi Kambanis, in his book, Privilege to Die on Hezbollah. He likened it to concentric circles, the way Hezbollah's support base exists. So the inner core, the fighting cadres, the leadership, the people who are dying, these are the ideologically, religiously hardcore. These are the people you're not going to budge, right? They also constitute maybe this much of Hezbollah's support base. As you go out, right, you have a much more heterodox relationship with religion and with Wilayat al-Faqih until you get to a point where you have people whose lifestyles, whose mentality is indistinguishable perhaps from yours or mine, except for the fact that they believe this organization takes care of them, right? So you're not having to break through necessarily ideological brainwashing, right? It's not the same as, like, say, changing Nasrallah's mind. Right. Yeah. It's some guy gets something out of Hezbollah, right? And that's usually pragmatic in this case. Again, is it protection against outside threats? Probably. Is it social services? Is it what's the Lebanese called wasta, right? Like political connections that get you jobs, right? Is it orphanages? Is it the schools? Is it the social services? Is it the municipal services they provide? You're like, hey, these guys take care of me, right?
Do you think then in some ways that at a practical level, the last question I'll ask, the practical level, do you think that if the Islamic Republic were to be removed and you were to have, whether it's the Shah and constitutional monarchy, or you just remove the Islamic Republic from the equation, is that the most practical thing that we can do to...
No.
No.
To get rid of these extensions? No, because here's the genius of the Iranian model.
David, what are you doing to me? I set you up.
I'm sorry.
This is why I don't talk to you people, or why I hate you guys, because you're so much smarter than me, and I just I say these things. It's just like you're just like, no, that's not going to happen.
I'm just well, look, I mean, would it weaken them significantly? Of course, but here's the genius of the Iranian model. This is why, unless you break the relationship between the Shiites and Hezbollah will continue to exist in some form, because the genius of the Iranian model is that an extension like Hezbollah, not an actor like Hamas, which, they've kind of cornered into being one of their proxies and kind of gutted it from the inside. Hezbollah is at once 100% Lebanese and 100% loyal to Iran. It is their DNA, right? So take the money away, take the arms away, take everything away, right? Khamenei is like, give me money, and they're like, sure thing, boss. They are loyal to him. The movement, the group. There is no Hezbollah without Wilayat al-Faqih. It would not be Hezbollah. It would be something else.
So even if you get rid of Iran, there's still going to be the Islamic resistance to whatever, and that's still going to exist inside of Lebanon, and it's still going to be a part of the political social structure.
And the reason why is because if the linkage between you, right? So Iran needs Hezbollah when they tell Hezbollah to jump, Hezbollah needs to say how high, right?
Yeah.
That dynamic exists not because of material support, not because of weapons, but because of ideology. You can allow your proxy to go and develop their own autonomous weapons productions capabilities, fundraising capabilities, right? To the point where they don't need you to survive. If anything, it's
but doesn't the money matter? Doesn't the money, like if the money isn't there to take care of the social services, if the money isn't there to take care of the bribes?
So that's my point. Hezbollah has, it may shrink support. Like, let's say, we don't know what Hezbollah's ledgers look like. So let's say they get 50% from Iran and 50% from their own, own endeavors. And that budget shrinks by 50% if Iran falls. Yeah, you're going to have some Shiites say, well, we don't need you anymore, right? You're not taking care of me anymore. But again, the point is Hezbollah has all these other means of fundraising on its own, and we actually don't know what percentage of Hezbollah's money comes from Iran versus what it raises on its own. And this is part of the genius of the Iranian model is they want these groups to have longevity, permanence, and you don't have permanence, right? Your parents wanted you to be successful. They didn't do that by saying you're going to have to live, you're not allowed to go to college and you have to stay at home for the rest of your life, right? They want you to be successful, and they trust that you're going to love them, right? It's a parent-child relationship. So no, go get a college degree, go get a job, go to Hezbollah, develop your own means of fundraising. That'll take burden off of Iran, by the way, which is squeezed by sanctions, and it'll ensure your durability. And we're not worried about you turning on us because the linkage is ideological.
All right. Well, so that was the worst answer. Just like like for everybody that's listening, he's looking at me. He's like, "Yeah, it is." Like he's smirking right now. He's like, "Oh man, this is awesome. I can't wait to just like deflate everybody."
This is why no one invites me to parties. This is why
clearly nobody invites you to parties. Yeah, Dan Senor doesn't only has you on like every now and then because otherwise you would just make his day worse. Exactly. He invites like Amit Segal and the Daviel or Jonathan Sanders who's like, "Yeah, like Israel's fucking crushing it right now," and he's like, "Great," and then you come on, you're like, "Actually, things are terrible," and he's like, "Well, I'm not having him on again."
Look, I mean, if I have to say purely militarily, the most successful front militarily was the Lebanon front, right? The way it was conducted was masterful in terms of the integration of intelligence with military operations. The depth and penetration of Hezbollah was done. Every mistake that Israel made in 2006, it rectified and then some with 2006. The way it sequenced and everything, the way it even dealt with built the legitimacy, legal and otherwise, with the international community to escalate the operations against Hezbollah. 360 success. Now, this is what we call in law necessary but not sufficient, right? Because Israel cannot finish. The question is not, did Israel succeed in the war? Israel did succeed in the war. The question is, how do you finish the job? Because that is beyond Israel's means, right? Because you have an army of 500,000 people, including the cooks, right? People think the IDF can do whatever. Tiny army, economy small. It's not the United States. Can't just manufacture weapons as much as it wants. So Israel has, in terms of manpower, in terms of its arsenal, very limited capabilities. It can't occupy all of Lebanon up to the Bekaa Valley, up to Beirut, South Lebanon for 6-7 months and dismantle this, or it doesn't have the capability to do that. So the job necessarily has to fall to Lebanon, and the problem is that Lebanon's not acting, and that's why we're seeing this resurgence.
Okay, well, you have to leave us with something that we can, like some teeny tiny thing of whether it's inspiration or positive, anything that you can pull out that we now are going to go and hold on to for the rest of our lives. What is you got to leave us with something positive. Otherwise, I'm going to be depressed myself after this. So hit me with the thing that you are most optimistic about. I'm
not optimistic. I've never used the term optimistic. I am cautiously pessimistic.
Hopeful?
But look,
hopeful? Is there any hopeful?
There's a sense of positivity, I guess, is the best I can give you. Look, the opportunity that confronts the international community when it comes to Lebanon is unprecedented, right? There is a dynamism that exists now in this portfolio on this issue that has not existed in 40 years. If we play our cards right. right? If the international community plays its cards right, if the right pressure is brought to bear upon Lebanon, if the Israelis do things right, if the United States does things right, if we develop a multi-tiered and multi-partner strategy to finally get Lebanon to continue to squeeze Hezbollah, right? Because we have a problem now that Hezbollah is coming back. So what you want to do is at least, like, if Hezbollah has been degraded to 35%, keep them there. Because that's a degraded Hezbollah. The region is better off if Hezbollah is at 35% or just 50% than if it's at 100%. If that's the maximum we can do now, great. Let's keep it there. Let's use that as a baseline to move forward. But we need to put in place structures now that are able to prevent Hezbollah's resurgence. And only part of it, is the Israeli military operations, right? We need to press Lebanon more. We need to make the pain of going after Hezbollah less than the pain that Lebanon's going to suffer or endure if it doesn't go after Hezbollah. And this is going to take the French getting their act together, us getting smarter here in the United States getting smarter about the nature of Hezbollah's relationship with Lebanon and what it's going to take to perhaps, if we can, again, I'm very much anti-neocon on this because I don't think it works, how we can break the Shiites away from Hezbollah. If we can figure that out, if we and our partners, our regional partners, can figure out how to do that, how to create a wedge that will continue to fracture and grow in time, then this organization will never resurge.
All right. So from what I understand, we need a multifaceted strategy over the long term. We need a bunch of countries to come together, to work together. We need France to get it together and be smart. We need the United States of America to be smarter. We need Qatar to care about this. And now I understand why you're definitely pessimistic. All you had to do is explain how it happens. You're like, no, there's no way. There's no way.
These different elements all contribute in their own way, and they all have to work in synchrony, right? They all have to synchronize. And again, it's going to take the United States putting the right pressure on Lebanon. It's going to take France and our Gulf partners, particularly the Qataris, not acting as a backdoor, like a release valve for that pressure. Yeah. And it's going to take the Israelis continuing to weaken Hezbollah militarily to where the price for the Lebanese of going after them continues to go down. Over time, right? If there are actors that have the social clout in Lebanon that can start to begin this movement in Lebanon of the Shiites away from Hezbollah, over time, this will reduce the cost of going after Hezbollah for Lebanon, because really the only entity on earth that can put an end to Hezbollah's existence is Lebanon. And it's going to happen gradually. First, if you ask me, Lebanon has to start by enforcing the rule of law against everyone. Normalize the rule of law so that the concept sinks into everyone's mind that when the government says something, you have to comply with it. It's not like every man for himself, right? So when the government says you don't project the picture of Nasrallah on Raush, Iraq, you don't project the picture of Nasrallah on Raush. Start small. Don't go after their arsenal right now. Start small. Start with normalizing Beirut's sovereignty in small ways. Parking tickets, pulling licenses, then go from there to the economic level, because where Hezbollah thrives, right? We can slam them with all of our sanctions, and why are they still not degrading to the point where we'd like them? Because they exist in this economic gray zone that's called Lebanon's cash economy, right? So after you've normalized rule of law, then you get to the point where you tell the central bankers or the governor of the central bank, start squeezing this cash economy, start standardizing the economy, make sure everything is on the up and up and on the books. Lebanon benefits, and you get rid of all these organizations. Again, over time, this will create a process that normalizes pushing all these the problem here, and here's my counterpoint, is that all the feudal organizations are going to suffer as a result, and none of them want to suffer. None of them want to. And they all coalesce around their sectarian flag when it's necessary. On that depressing note,
overall we've been at this for almost 2 hours now, and David, number one, I just wanted to say thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
It was really incredible. I think that's very enlightening, both from a Jewish perspective, a Jewish peoplehood perspective, and certainly from a Lebanon perspective, because I don't think that anybody has ever explained Lebanon to me in this particular way, and I definitely think that in some way, shape, or form, and you could tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though that, like, despite the fact that you only spent the first 6 months of your life in Lebanon, there's still something that clearly is driving you to be one of probably the only few people that actually care enough about this country to want to move the needle even 1%, while everybody else is focused on the big guys like Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Iran. And so just thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise, and thank you for believing that moving the needle 1% is worth it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.